The 3 test scripts were returned to the Block C supervisor. Unsurprisingly, the Block supervisor would be going to give Melvin a good talking to. Over on this side, Carter became idle again. Following routine, he had lunch before noon and went back to his office area to read while waiting for inmates to come. The inmates' afternoon break was from noon to 2 in the afternoon. This was also the time in the day that inmates were given the most freedom. Some inmates would take an afternoon nap in the cell blocks, but more of them would be outside. After all, lights out was at 10 o'clock every night. It naturally was that the hours that they had in the day were especially precious. With the rising temperature in recent days, more people also came to the library to pass the time. Officer James. An inmate came up to Carter's office desk with a detective novel. "I've finished the book. Do you have any other recommendations?" Carter's gaze slid away from a corner in the distance, picked up the scanner to return the book, and said, "The works from this author are all pretty good. You can go check them out." The inmate went to the fiction section, looking for other works from the same author, whereas Carter continued to turn his gaze to the man in the distance. Melvin had come to the library, but he didn't borrow any books. He merely sat by the window watching inmates who were chilling in the yard outside, his thoughts inscrutable. Carter really couldn't get a handle on this man. He hid half his face behind the computer screen, looking at Melvin's side profile in slight vexation. As Luke said, Carter was a gay man who had high standards for appearance and body build. The primary reason for this was because he himself was quite a looker, as such his standards for choosing a partner wouldn't be low as well. Luke was a pretty good partner. He was funny, accommodating, and sympathetic to the weak. But once Carter completely understood him, that was also when his passion completely fizzled out. But the paradox was that compared to actual interaction, Carter preferred to spy on others from the darkness. This was because when he had completely gotten a grasp of someone, he would also completely lose interest in that person, and there was nothing that sped up this process more than actual contact. Humans were by nature a mess of contradictions. Only today did Carter learn that seeing through someone would bore him, whereas not seeing through someone would vex him. Just then, Melvin seemed to sense Carter's gaze from across the room, suddenly turning his head over and meeting his gaze head-on. But Carter didn't dodge this time. The library was his territory. He had every reason to observe every inmate in the library. Melvin seemed not to expect that Carter would stare back at him this brazenly. He was initially casually seated on the chair, his shoulders slumped naturally, but after meeting Carter's gaze, he leaned back into the chair and folded his arms before his chest, affecting a posture of returning the compliment in kind. The two of them were sitting in the two corners in the library by the windows without anyone blocking their line of sight in between. From the start, the library was already quiet. Their gazes met silently in the air, sounding out and staring each other down, as if they had reached a common understanding that whoever looked away first lost. Carter's attitude in the present was completely different from his attitude in the past. Back when Melvin was only his neighbor, he would feel guilt for secretly watching him. But now, their identities had changed. Melvin had become an inmate, and he was a prison officer in charge of the inmates. Moreover, the library was his territory. He had no reason to bow his head before Melvin. Until the corners of Melvin's lips suddenly curled up subtly in a faint smile that yet also wasn't quite a smile. Carter's heart thumped and the focus in his gaze suddenly scattered. He endured for another 2 seconds before finally stepping out of battle, moving slightly and hiding his entire face behind the computer screen. Why would he smile? Did he find something interesting? His habit of analyzing others caused Carter to be unable to stop his thoughts from spiraling. Instead of calming down, his disorderly heartbeat began to beat even more chaotically. However, at this moment, a chair suddenly scraped the ground, cutting into Carter's thoughts. He raised his head towards the sound and saw that Melvin had stood up and was following another inmate out of the library through a door at the back. The inmate who he was following was one of the gangsters in prison, and his big brother was a murderer nicknamed Old Nine. Carter had a bad feeling about this. He waited for a while, but Melvin and the guy showing the way never passed by the front door of the library. Instead, some other people appeared out of nowhere and walked past the library towards the staircase. The library was located in a corner of the second floor. There was only one place even further inside, the recreation room. Carter quickly understood the situation. The inmate who brought Melvin to the recreation room chased the inmates originally occupying the room out. The recreation room wasn't large. Naturally, who could occupy it was determined by their hierarchy in the prison. Carter quickly pulled up the monitoring interface of the recreation room on his computer. As expected, he saw Old Nine and another of his lackeys inside, including the guy who led Melvin over. A total of 3 men surrounded Melvin. Carter had long expected that there would be people who wanted to mess with Melvin, only he never expected that these people would actually include Old Nine. Old Nine was a bald guy who was a member of a gang before being incarcerated as a result of a gang crime crackdown. Although his nickname was Old Nine, among all the inmates in the prison, he was ranked second on the list that no one wanted to mess with. "You do stocks, huh?" Old Nine was quite some shorter than Melvin and had to tilt his chin up when he spoke, yet this didn't give him any impression of vulnerability. Instead, he had a commanding presence. Carter only had wireless earphones on. The volume on it was a little low, so he turned the volume of his computer settings up. "Something wrong?" Melvin was facing the pinhole camera. He arched his eyebrows slightly, asking back without turning a hair. "What else can it be?" Carter thought to himself from behind the screen. Of course they can only mean to mess you up. The psychology of some prisoners was quite intriguing. They had obviously committed crimes too, yet in the face of a greater evil, they would actually task it upon themselves to punish evil. However, coming back to that, Old Nine wasn't any kind of saint. Before entering prison, he had committed a lot of atrocities that when compared to Melvin, he really didn't have any grounds to talk. "Screwed ordinary folks out of quite a lot of money, didn't you?" Old Nine said. "I saw it on the news, at least 100 million. Melvin didn't immediately respond. He indifferently scanned the 3 men around him, unhurriedly asking, "You called me over here to have a chat about this?" "Obviously not." Carter soundlessly moved his lips in response to Melvin's question. Seeing that Old Nine was here to extort money, he reckoned that aside from roughing Melvin up, Old Nine should also have another objective. "I'll just get straight to the point. Cough up a protection fee and Old Nine, will cover your ass. You should know that there are people in prison looking to mess you up." "Mess me up?" It was apparent that Melvin didn't understand the law of the prison. "Why?" "Are you really asking why?" The man who brought him over took a step forward, shoving Melvin's shoulder. "You screwed over the hard-earned money of innocent men and ruined so many families, and you still have the gall to ask why?" Melvin's brows furrowed, as if finally sorting out the logic within. But when he opened his mouth, he only said breezily, "I didn't harm anyone." "Ha, you're already in here and you're still claiming innocence?" Old Nine also took a step forward, shoving Melvin. "Kiddo, wise up. Prison isn't a nice place to be." "I repeat." Melvin's expression turned dark, seemingly losing his patience, each word clearly stressed. "I didn't harm anyone." Carter and Old Nine both didn't believe Melvin's words. However, his analysis was that Melvin wasn't trying to deny the truth, but that he didn't even feel that he had harmed anyone. Of course, this was also no more than James Chidging's unilateral analysis. Old Nine shoved Melvin another time, then nodded at the 2 lackeys. Carter counted to 3 in his heart. When he finished counting, the several people in the visual really did start coming to blows. One of the lackeys first tried to cover Melvin's mouth to prevent him from crying out for help, but Melvin never had the intention to do so from the start, catching the hand that came his way and throwing the man over his shoulder. Normally, upon coming across a fight between inmates, prison guards should immediately break it up. However, the recreation room had no other furniture aside from the 2 cabinets holding miscellaneous items. When these people started fighting, they didn't knock into the ground but against the wall, and it didn't cause much of a ruckus. Put in perspective that Carter was now in the library, far away from the recreation room on the other end. It made no sense that he would know that there was a scuffle going on inside. He continued to watch the surveillance. Melvin proved his experience in boxing. When the others landed their punches, they would merely impede his movements momentarily, whereas when he landed his punches, he would knock them several steps back. For the time being, regardless of the bet with Luke, Carter frankly didn't care who between the 2 parties would get their asses handed to them. In his eyes, these people were locked up because they had committed crimes. No matter the hierarchy in prison, this was their just dessert. At this moment, an agonized howl suddenly erupted from his wireless earphones. Having set the volume to the max, the howl almost caused Carter to bolt up from his seat in shock. Old Nine was lying feebly on the ground. His limbs were motionless from the way it looked, his mind was knocked dazed. And Melvin was straddled above him, slamming punch after punch into his face. The two lackeys appeared to be frightened stiff by Melvin, tacitly backing off and pressing up against the door of the recreation room, as if hesitating whether or not to call for help. But actually, there wasn't any need for them to do so. The disturbance just now had already attracted the attention of the inmates in the library. The inmates were presently looking towards the recreation room, and in the next moment, they would be looking at how Carter reacted. On this side, Carter had already flung his earphones into the drawer, rapidly taking out his walkie-talkie and notifying the patrol team. He hastily ran to the recreation room, because he knew that if Melvin kept with it, the situation was bound to go awry. The recreation room couldn't be locked. Carter sprinted up to it, straightaway wrenching the door open, shouting, 1017, stop. The two men blocking the door immediately retreated to one side and gazed helplessly between Carter and Melvin. The guards on the patrol team quickly appeared. Someone went up to check Old Nine's condition and notified Luke to come over. Another took out handcuffs and cuffed up the remaining three involved in the fight. This guy really cheated money? He's a damn lunatic, isn't he? The two lackeys swore angrily as the patrol team escorted them away. Following behind them, when Melvin walked past Carter, he suddenly stopped in his steps and looked at him, asking out of the blue, "How did you know it was me?" Carter started minutely. "What?" "When you opened the door just now," Melvin looked straight into Carter's eyes. "How did you know, without having to look, that the one doing the beating up was me?" Before Carter could respond, a guard on the patrol team escorted Melvin away. In truth, Carter didn't know how to respond, either. The security cameras in prison were different from the pinhole camera Carter installed. They were standard white cuboids and highly conspicuous. As it was, the recreation room was no more than 10 square meters and was completely devoid of anything attached to the ceiling. It was easy to tell with a single glance that there weren't any security cameras installed here. Taking a step back, even if there were security cameras installed in the recreation room, the connection would be linked to the control room, not the library. Just now when Carter ran over, Melvin's back was to the door. That aside, the two lackeys were right behind the door, blocking the view inside. No matter which way he spun it, Carter couldn't possibly have known right upon opening the door that it was Melvin who was doing the beating. However, what just happened was that Melvin's inmate number left Carter's tongue the very moment that he wrenched the door open. In other words, before entering the door, Carter had already known what was happening in the recreation room. Carter believed himself to be a careful and cautious person, otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to spy on others without being caught. But regarding this, he had to admit that he really did slip up. The situation just now was so urgent that he didn't have time to put too much thought into it. Now, in retrospect, he suddenly caught another problem. How did Melvin's brain react so quickly? Perhaps it was because he was in a 1v3 situation, thus was constantly paying attention to what was happening behind him, or perhaps it was because he was sensitive to the matter of surveillance, thus could instantly find the faults in Carter's behavior. But whatever the reason, this wouldn't be the logical reasoning of someone with a low IQ. A premonition suddenly emerged in Carter's mind. Melvin didn't seem to be as simple-minded as he had thought. He forcibly suppressed his unease and consoled himself that there wouldn't be someone so omnipotent as to discover his secret just because he had revealed a teensy opening. Old Nine is in pretty bad shape. Near the end of the day, Luke returned to the prison from a hospital outside and came to pass the time chatting with Carter. Leaving the concussion aside, Luke spoke and pointed out the positions on himself. His right wrist bones and joints are dislocated and fractured. I don't know how he got such severe injuries. Actually, Carter did know. When Old Nine tried to punch Melvin, Melvin took a small step back and returned a punch straight to the fist that Old Nine was throwing at him. Carter had seen this action countless times before when Melvin was boxing the sandbag at home. Back then, he didn't have much of an impression of it. But when his earphones rang with a howl that resembled a butchered pig, he then realized how terrifying Melvin's fists were. 3 words. He deserved it, Carter concluded. Let's not talk about Old Nine for now, Luke said. It's been less than 3 days and people have come to mess Melvin up. Don't flake out on the Michelin restaurant you promised before. Wait, are you sure this counts as being messed up? Carter stopped Luke. Technically speaking, it was him who messed Old Nine up. That's how you're counting it? Luke challenged with lifted eyebrows. He already beat Old Nine up to such a sorry state. No one would dare to provoke him in the next good while. Your time limit was a week. Doesn't this count as a tie then? Not necessarily, Carter said. What if Shay wants to get revenge for old Nine? You know he won't, said Luke. Well, that he did. Shay was the inmate who had been in prison for the longest time, also the big brother that old Nine was under. However, their temperaments were vastly different. Shay had been in prison for over a decade and had long learned restraint. The principle he adhered to was don't offend me and I won't offend you. Hence, as long as the sleeping dragon wasn't poked, there wasn't any cause for worry. In a situation like this where old Nine had gone after someone and gotten himself roughed up, Shay naturally wouldn't intervene. Forget it then, Carter said. Originally, what he expected was for Melvin to drive away the first wave of people who came to trouble him, drawing even more public anger, followed by a second wave of even stronger people. But Luke was right. Now that Melvin pummeled old Nine to the point of requiring external hospitalization, was there anyone who would still dare to provoke him? Why don't we just have a casual meal, Luke suggested. There's a decent restaurant that opened in the city recently, do you want to give it a go? Sure, Carter said. Let's do this Friday. Time in the night was precious on working days. A trip to the city was a 40-minute drive, so only when the weekends came was Carter willing to go down to the city. Not long after returning home from work, the hot summer day finally welcomed the first rainstorm of the year. Dark clouds were densely clumped in the sky, interlaced with thunder and lightning like the apocalypse had come, and the only sound left in the world was the roar of pouring rain. Carter made sure that all the windows in his house were tightly shut. However, when he looked over at the small house across the road, he couldn't help but stop moving and stare at it for a while. With no windows in the way, the curtains in the bedroom were being tossed in the rain by the fierce wind. The ink blotch on the wall had also been spread by the downpour, making it look even gloomier. Melvin was sentenced to a $300 million fine. He probably didn't have enough liquidity in hand, and even this house was seized by the court, causing the community workers to harp on this for a good time. Carter shifted his gaze away, drawing the curtains in his house. The torrential rain left as quickly as it came. By the time Carter was getting ready for bed, tranquility was restored to the community outside. Lately, Carter no longer looked across at what was happening on the other side. However, he was mildly curious today how Melvin's house would end up after the rain stopped. So he casually lifted the curtains, glancing across at the other side. At this, his movements immediately pulled to a stop. The man in black had appeared in Melvin's house again. As the curtains were completely blown open by the fierce wind, Carter's view was completely unobstructed this time. And so he saw that the man in black had tossed Melvin's wardrobe upside down, not neglecting even the springs in the mattress. Any fool could see that the man in black was looking for something. Carter didn't hesitate, immediately calling the police. But this time he didn't see the man in black at the first moment, so that he had already left Melvin's house before the police arrived. Nevertheless, it didn't look as if he had managed to find what he was looking for.